Can I have your attention, please? Can I have your attention, please? I recognize that some of you are still finishing the dessert or yet to sample it. But I want to make sure that we have enough time for our luncheon speaker, for his comments as well as from questions from you. Our luncheon speaker today is Akram Khater. He's a full professor of history. Matter of fact, very recently promoted full professor, so congratulations again, Akram. Professor of history at North Carolina State University, and I might add, probably one of the finest experts in Middle Eastern studies. He's also the director of international programs at North Carolina State University. He's a native of Lebanon. He earned a Bachelor of Science degree in electronics engineering from Cal Poly State University, and holds a master's degree and a PhD degree in history from the University of California, Santa Cruz, and the University of California, Berkeley, respectively. Before coming to Raleigh, he taught at Ball State University in Indiana. Professor Khater is a prolific writer. He's contributed a great deal to his field of Middle Eastern history by publishing a substantial number of articles and reviews. He also sits on the editorial boards of several journals and book series. Now, let me tell you the inside story about why I've asked Dr. Khater to be here. Any of you who saw very early editions of our conference program recognized that we originally had the ambassador from Syria to the United States to be speaking to you now. Probably no surprise to you, but I was really hoping that things would die down in Syria. They did not. I received a call a little over 3 weeks ago from the ambassador saying, Scott, I am frozen in Washington. I am not traveling anywhere. And matter of fact, even if I could come to talk to you, I would say nothing. I said, well, that's a problem. But knowing that we really wanted to dwell today on the whole issue of what's going on in North Africa, in the Middle East, particularly what's known as the Arab Spring, I was looking for the very best person I could to come talk to us. And Akram and I had done a television show, what, six, 7 years ago together on similar issues involved with the United States invasion of Iraq in 2003. And I was very, very impressed with his grasp of all the cultural issues that were involved in that and how that integrates with what the United States position is. So Akram, who's a very busy professor, I had to promise him everything. I think it was a cup of coffee that you finally bought off on, Akram, agreed to come over and speak to us. So it's a personal and professional privilege to introduce to you Dr. Akram Khater. Akram?
Good afternoon. It's always good to be introduced as a pinch hitter. Thank you, Scott, for the invitation, even if it's belated. And I'm certainly not an ambassador, but I'll be able to speak today. So it's a good difference from that. So I'm going to speak for about half an hour. And I think that will allow us time to questions and answers. And it's always good to speak when you're eating dessert because it kind of sweetens what I'm saying and you actually think that I'm really saying something profound. So allow me to be a historian for a few moments, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to review very quickly American foreign policy in the Middle East. I know I'm supposed to speak about the Arab Spring, but I think we can't really understand the Arab Spring, and perhaps more importantly, how it is that we weren't even aware that there's going to be an Arab Spring, which may be now stretching into an Arab Autumn, without understanding American foreign policy. So a very quick note on that. If anybody sort of was looking to understand how is it that the United States is involved in the Middle East, we really can talk about two phases, right? The first phase is post-World War II, all the way to, some could say, the first, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait for the first time, or you can go all the way to September 11th. That would be the first phase. The second phase would be, of course, what happens after September 11th. So after World War II, clearly, as you all know better than I do, the United States became a superpower and embraced its role, if you will, as an empire, to sort of replace the British and the French empires of the 19th century. And perhaps the key moment, if you will, in that transfer of power came around in Iran. in 1951 to 1953, when the Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, was overthrown in a CIA-sponsored coup, but really there are a lot more to it than that. And it was a very cheap coup, $60,000. I don't think he can get by these days with that. So it was the moment, if you will, when we pushed the British aside because they were fumbling and really being messy in their way they were dealing with Mossadegh. And ultimately we became the superpower in the region. And in that sense, from that point on, all the way up to 2001, to just make it simple, the United States really had a very simple and straightforward foreign policy in the Middle East. And that is status quo. And it really was premised on two things. One is stability in the sense that of oil. If you look specifically at the coup in 1951, 1953, of course we were very much concerned with the communism. Anybody who looks at a map of the region realizes that the Soviet Union at that time was much closer than the United States. They had a lot more assets that they can bring to bear, and the oil fields were within reach. So if Iran fell, you can understand the domino theory effect. So really we were highly concerned about the resources, because not only we were becoming more dependent on oil from the Middle East, although I think our dependency was overblown, it's more importantly that the world economy was dependent on the Middle East. And if the world economy is dependent on the oil from the Middle East, it meant that the United States economy, which benefited from that, really was intimately linked to who controls the oil fields. So in that sense, we were very much interested in stability. And stability for us meant one thing and one thing, regardless of whether that is a support of a regime that is friendly to the United States, pro-American, regardless of whether that regime is democratic or undemocratic. Whether it is a Saudi royal family or whether it is Shah of Iran, who ultimately gets kicked out in 1978-79. And it is really interesting if you look at Life magazine from 1952, I believe. There's an article there that was kind of talking about American foreign policy, and it really summarizes in the sense that it says, look, the illiterate masses, the ineffectual and really irrelevant intellectuals, and the various political elites really have nothing to do with American interests. What we really need to do in order to expand American interests in the region is to have strong men and kings. And in that captures, if you will, how we came to approach the Middle East. We came to approach it as a place where we draw oil from. That really is the case. Because I can honestly say, if the Middle East was really rich in asparagus, I do not think we would have spent so much time in the region, right? So in essence then, oil becomes a critical element, and we were willing to overlook all sorts of things, specifically because we wanted to maintain the flow of oil. And the second part of this formula was, of course, Israel. And I really don't care whether you support or against Israel. This is not the point. The point, however, is that Israel becomes very critical to United States foreign policy. And increasingly, especially as we approach the 21st century, American foreign policy becomes very skewed in favor of Israel. And again, you may very well support that, but that's not the issue here. The issue is that from the point of view of the Middle East, that is exactly how things looked. That the United States, despite its rhetoric in terms of democracy and despite what it stood for, in fact, stood for two things in terms of people living in the region. One, the export of oil and maintaining that export of oil, and two, support for the state of Israel. So when people look at the Middle East and wonder why people aren't really necessarily happy, at least the majority, it is really not surprising, because most of the time when the United States intervened, and we intervened, by the way, repeatedly from the 1950s thereafter, whether it is in terms of landing troops or whether it is in terms of behind the scenes, our intervention has always been, in many ways, detrimental to the interests of the populations at large. Now, the reason for that is because we saw the Middle East from really two angles. And it's a black and white situation. It's either that the communists are going to take over, the Cold War mentality, or we are going to expand our interests. After the fall of the Soviet Union, and after especially 9/11, of course we shifted. And we shifted to a new boogeyman, and that's called Islamic fundamentalism. And our eyes were so focused on global terrorism and its impact on the United States that we maintained to a certain extent the same policy. And that is, we were willing to ignore, despite the rhetoric of course, we were willing to ignore the nefarious activities of rulers within the region, their illegitimacy, and the fact that they were not really nice to their people, specifically because we were much more concerned with the fact that we have a war to win on terrorism. Again, this is not to underestimate 9/11, nor is it to underestimate the fact that we do need to respond to people who attack us. That is not the issue here. What I'm trying to argue is that both in the first phase, Cold War mentality, and the second phase, the rise of the Islamic fundamentalist threat, what we have done is we basically reduced the Middle East to two options. And the options are either the communists will win or we will win. Either the Islamic fundamentalists will win or we will win. And those were the only two options possible. And furthermore, what we reduce it to is the fact that there's only one group of people we can deal with. And that is these strong men and kings that I alluded to and that I quoted from the Life magazine issue of 1951. So in other words, what we ignored is the great masses of people that lived in the region, their hopes, their aspirations, their dreams. Now, we don't have to, just because I went to Berkeley doesn't mean we have to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, but at the same time, ignoring these people's desires, hopes, and dreams is very problematic. For two reasons. One is it pisses them off. It's as simple as that. We lose their hearts and minds. We lose them to various people that are willing to say, look, the United States is an incredibly hypocritical place. It is cynical in its manipulation of world policy because all they care about, despite their rhetoric of democracy and civilization, is the fact that they want to get our oil. And that message plays very well because it rings true. And secondly, we lose them because in essence, when we support the King of Saudi Arabia, and look, I mean, again, there's realpolitik involved, and I understand why we'd want to have a really nice relationship with the King of Saudi Arabia. When we support the Shah of Iran, again, realpolitik, we are also doing this. There's a cost involved. If we do not recognize the cost that's involved, we are, in essence, shooting ourselves in the foot. We are underestimating what the blowback will be. So in many ways, all the way to September 11th then, and even past it, our eyes have been focused, we have understood the Middle East through this very fine prism. It's either you are a communist, this is before 9/11, or afterwards you're an Islamic fundamentalist, that is the bad guy, or you're the good guy, the good Arab, right? Whatever that is. The fact of the matter is the good Arab, in essence, turns out to be these rulers that have suppressed their people. Now, what we have also missed, and this gets me back to why all of a sudden we're seeing, beginning in January, this explosion of protests, and their particular shape. What we missed is that there's something called the demographic bulge. If you look at the Middle East today, you will find that, depending upon the country you go to, but on average, the MENA region, Middle East and North Africa region, those who are 29 and younger make 60% of the population, right? So let me repeat that for a second. Those who are 29 or younger make up 60% of the population. The equivalent in the United States is about 32%. So it's double that population. Most of these people were born, well, all of these people were obviously born after independence, and many of them grew up, both in the 1990s and 2000, seeing American power as a sort of this powerful overlord, hegemon, coming into the region. But more importantly about the United States, and in many ways, the story really isn't about the United States. The story is about this generation that grows up, and in some countries they make up 73% of the population. They grow up in a certain environment that is inimical to their hopes, dreams, and aspirations. So here's the environment that most of these people grew up in. And I'm going to take Egypt as my example, and then I'm going to go back and discuss why it is that we see them exploding now and not 5, 10, 20 years ago. So if you look to Egypt, for example, let me give you some snapshots. If you were to go to a public school, you will find that most classrooms had 70 to 80 students in them, right? A high school teacher was paid $30 a month. I had the privilege once of standing in one of this huge sewage tubes before they turned the power on, that was being constructed with USAID money and British aid money to take sewage out of Cairo out. And it's a huge thing. I mean, this thing was large. And what is remarkable about it is that the minute they turned that switch on, as I stepped aside, it was obsolete. It could not deal with the 30 million people that lived in Cairo alone. Cairo was a place of congestion. Cairo was a place of poverty. Let me give you another statistic. Not only are we talking about a lot of young people, but we're talking a lot of poor young people. So, on average, unemployment in the age group of 25 and below, and this is an average, is 25%. Okay? More likely than not, in most places it goes up to 40, and some places 60%. So what you have happening when we enter into the 21st century is we have a generation that is on one hand making its way slowly and painfully but surely through a broken educational system that is meant simply to replicate the oppressive regimes under which they're growing. And yet, when they graduate, whether it's high school or university, they have no jobs. It's a dead-end road. And if you have no job, you cannot buy an apartment. If you cannot buy an apartment, you cannot get married. If you cannot get married, you do not start your life. In Algeria, there's a name for these guys. It's an amalgam of Arabic and French. It's called Haitiste. And Haitiste comes from the Arabic word wall, height, and east, of course, is the French amalgam. It's the people who stand on the walls. That's what it means. And you see them. They're basically a generation that is lost. That is lost in every sense of the word. They have no idea where to go. The only place available when you don't have any income is to go sit in a coffee shop, drink a lot of caffeine with your hormones flying. It's a very explosive combination, let me tell you. So it is no surprise then that some of these people were recruited by things like Al-Qaeda. It's not. Because what Al-Qaeda offered them is the potential to have a meaning to their lives. Now, of course, it's a false potential. We know that. But that's because we live in a comfortable life. When you're sitting in an environment where there's nothing else, what in the world will you do? And in many ways, if you want to understand them, you can think about gangs in American urban cities. That is exactly the kind of approach that you have within urban cities that have been neglected. If you look at most of these places where we are finding the recruitment first in the beginning of the 21st century, and in many ways, the men and the women that came and exploded on the streets as we have seen it, what you will find is that the government has completely ignored them. They left them to be. Whether it is in terms of collecting garbage, water, sewage, electricity, schooling. There are no social services for a lot of these people. So ultimately what we find then is a generation that's growing up very frustrated. It has no horizon. It doesn't see it. It doesn't see where that's going to go because all they see is this wall of desperation that they're living in. And on top of that, what they find is a political regime that is very good at suppressing its people. They're excellent at it, actually, because we send our own people to get tortured there. They have had years in the name of fighting terrorism, some of it legitimate, of course, but in the name of fighting terrorism, they've done a lot more than that. It is things that we have not seen, actually. We didn't notice them. It's not that they weren't there. They were there. I was just talking to Suzanne earlier, and I said, in the Middle East, there's always a prison, and it's usually in the city capital, where there are no windows. You never want to go to that prison. Trust me. Right? I came close to it one time. But if you enter that prison, you basically are not heard of. But the problem is the following, and here's the second part. So not only are we talking about demographic bulge, that all of a sudden is making a lot of demands on on a regime that is incredibly outdated, a regime that is medieval in many ways. And if you want to understand how medieval it is, think about the iconic image of the revolution in Egypt. That iconic image is when a group of camel riders, of all things in the world, by the way, growing up in the Middle East, I never saw a camel in my life, but a camel riders somehow coming out of the medieval times, charging in the midst of, notebook-toting protesters. You can see the clash of this medieval mentality and the modern world. And this is the second part of why we see it happening now. This generation grew up frustrated, but it grew up connected to the internet. And in many ways, their frustrations, their anger becomes networked. 50% of Facebook users are Arabic speakers. 50%. They're the largest population that use Facebook, right? So in essence, it's not Facebook or Twitter that caused the revolution. I think that is an incredibly silly fallacy. Those are tools, but they're tools that connected them to different ways of being. They could see very clearly that there are different ways of existing. They could read a small booklet published by a guy who's about 78 years old sitting in Massachusetts about how to overthrow regimes, translated into Arabic. They could connect with Serbian activists who overthrew their own authoritarian regime. The Egyptian protesters could get Facebook and Twitter messages from Tunisian protesters telling them that vinegar and club soda are excellent, plus onions, are excellent countervailing tools against tear gas. This kind of connection is very important in terms of the infrastructure of the revolution. This didn't happen overnight. These guys had been plotting this, believe it or not, for years. In fact, the first time it happened was in 2006 when there was an April youth movement that called for everybody in Egypt to descend upon the streets to protest the high cost of living. Labor unions, which we haven't heard about very much, but in fact, if you actually look carefully, labor unions were instrumental in all of this. And they had been protesting for many, many times because they have the organizational and the political consciousness that is necessary for this. But what's also important to understand is that the internet age is exactly the counterpoint to the age of prisons with no windows. So, for example, in Alexandria, when a young blogger was accosted in a coffee shop where he was sitting and blogging about the Mubarak regime and its abuses of human rights, he was accosted by 3 plainclothes security men who took him to the back and beat him to death. This, unfortunately for them, was filmed, and that went viral. When a young man in Tunisia was protesting the absolutely abusive nature of Tunisian government bureaucracy that does not allow for the human dignity of a human being trying to make a living by taking away from them the only capital investment they made, which is an electronic weight thing, I don't know, scale, electronic scale that you measure fruits and vegetables to sell them, because the guy had a degree from the university and that's all he could do to feed his mother, his 3 siblings, and his ailing uncle. When he was humiliated in public and he set himself on fire and ultimately dies, that went viral. So the internet in many ways does not allow for anonymity. It does not allow for people to be abused and tortured and killed without anybody knowing. Somebody is there to watch. And that is an incredibly powerful element. Now there's a third element that explains this revolution. The demographic bulge, the technology is fine, everything. But ironically, it's the American invasion of Iraq. It is not because of what the neocons had hoped to accomplish. The idea that if you topple one authoritarian ruler and replace him with a, foreign implanted democratic institution, somehow the whole Middle East is going to change. That's not really what caused it. If somebody was actually reading the material that was coming out from this generation, as well as other people, what basically the Iraq War did was to show the ineptitude, the lack of vision of the Arab ruling elites. It showed them as a bunch of bystanders, as the United States simply toppled one Arab ruler and possibly threatened to topple others. It showed that the Arab leadership, whether it's the Saudis, the Egyptians, or what have you, are completely useless. They have nothing to offer. Nothing. They cannot offer their people any vision out of this quagmire, this medieval notion in which they have placed their own population. And the days of speaking about colonialism, which was very real, by the way, were long gone. You cannot blame outside people anymore. It's done. You have to turn inwards. And that is what's really fascinating about this Arab Spring. It's the idea that if you look at the participants, they looked inwards, every one of them. None of them turned around and says it's the United States' fault, it's Russia's fault, it's the French and the British fault. They could have easily said all of this because we have a certain amount of blame for it. But the reality is, and this is what's so powerful about this, and this is what's hopeful, is the fact that they turned inwards and they said, it's our fault. We have allowed this. And in many ways, they've come to the point that they realize when you really have nothing left, really, I mean, what do you have left? When you have no job, no hope for a job, no future, when you can be beaten at will and taken by the quote-unquote security forces, what the heck do you have left? And ultimately then, one has to use a cliche here, but it's a truth. The only thing you have to fear is fear itself. That's it. Because the minute you stop being afraid of a bullying and abusive government, then they have nothing over you. Nothing. Nothing at all over you. And again, I'll use another iconic moment to show you what I mean. I don't know how many of you have seen the YouTube footage of the Battle of the Bridge, which was, I don't know if you've ever been to Egypt, but those of you who have been will know that there's a Nile that cuts Egypt in half, and there's a small island, it's called Zamalek, or Giza, the Zamalek area, and they were crossing a bridge into Tahrir Square. And that battle of going back and forth, it's not so much that the protesters win, it's just if you see the dynamics, it's almost a ballet. It's a ballet with fear, in which you can sense when the police forces and the security forces at first are turning their guns, as well as tear gas, as well as water guns, against the protesters. They go back and forth, ultimately to the point where you can see one individual that just simply goes up, and that's it, I'm done. We saw it in Tiananmen Square, of course, with the one person standing in front of the tank. Those kinds of acts, of powerful acts, are not individual and they die off. So they're captured and they're replicated and they give strength and power. And that's why we see this being duplicated today in the most oppressive state in the Middle East, which is Syria, to my mind. And I'm not saying that because I'm of Lebanese origin, right? So the question is, where now? Look, I mean, as you can probably tell from the way I've told this narrative, this story, is I'm incredibly proud of what's going on in the Middle East. I think this is the one moment where being Arab is a good thing. And I'm not saying that facetiously. Being Arab in this country has been a really bad thing. And I'm not talking about just 9/11. Think about Valentino and the silent movies. Think about Mr. Magoo, right? Every character in popular culture in the United States of about an Arab is not a good character. We're either lascivious, chasing after white women, think of Birth of a Nation and the KKK concept, or we have oil barrels in our backyard and we're depicted as a bunch of people who have unfortunately received a lot of wealth. I can assure you I had no oil in my backyard, right? Or we are more frequently than not, especially if you follow movies from Hollywood in the 80s, 90s, and 2000, we just somehow are born out of our mother's womb shouting "Death to America" with a bomb in our right hand and the Quran in our left hand, right? That is the stereotype, that's the images. So it's not that I'm really proud at this moment that there's something positive about this whole thing, that all of a sudden somebody who is Arab could be the director of Google in the Middle East and can participate. So I'm proud of all of that, of course, but I'm not naive. This is what Scott asked me to reflect upon, and historians are very loath to look at the future. We're much more comfortable in 18th century archives, from which I just came not too long ago. And I love the archives. I just sit there and it's quiet and it's papers and I think I can control my environment. The future, we're not so confident about. But I will tell you that despite my pride, despite my sense of hopefulness and the idea of an Arab Spring, I also, and as I was joking earlier, do believe that we're going to have an Arab autumn. If revolution, histories of revolution tell us anything, is that they're not all positive. Sure, here are the problems that we're going to face. You got rid of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, but his establishment is nowhere gone. And I'm not just talking about the 400 families that owned more than 65% of the wealth of Egypt. I'm talking about the bureaucracy that he created, the security forces, and just the very mundane human beings who go to work from 8 to 8:30 in the morning and basically just simply rubber stamp things. There's a whole culture of these guys, and that's going to take a long time. So that's one problem. It's not going to happen overnight. Second, nobody knows where we're going. It's easy when you have a revolution in the sense that you get rid of people. You hate them. We saw that in Iran. Everybody agreed the Shah must go. He left, but then the problem is who's to replace him? How do we replace him? What model of governance do we have? And I think a lot of people were concerned, and that's why you kept hearing about the Muslim Brotherhood as a fear that they're going to take over from somebody like Hosni Mubarak. And the argument would go something like this. Yeah, Hosni Mubarak is a dictator and he's a mean guy and he's a jerk and what have you, but he's our jerk, our mean guy. You can hear echoes here of he's our dictator, right? But the fact of the matter is we don't know what's going to happen next. The Muslim Brotherhood may very well win. There's no doubt about it. And we may very well see a conservative shift in terms of social and political policies within the region. Again, I'm not sure, but it's not going to be the same. Tunisia is very different than Yemen. And Yemen is very different than Egypt. In other words, there's no single prognosis for what's going to happen in terms of these revolutions. But I can tell you one thing that I know for sure. Very much like the French Revolution and the Grand Terror that we had, the Great Fear that we had happening after the revolution, the fact of the matter is things will settle down. We're going to swing back and forth. And the reason I'm hopeful about things settling down in a fairly positive way is that one thing is clear. Nobody is willing to accept any more single party, single ruler. That age is gone. There is no doubt it's going to disappear. Nobody is willing to go back to those years. What kind of form of democracy will emerge? Nobody knows. I don't know. And neither can United States foreign policy makers determine that, nor should we, by the way. Because if we actually begin to interfere, I think we will create problems much more than we will do any good. And I'm not saying that facetiously again, I think it's true. This is something that these guys have to deal with. And we have to trust that we have to shift our approach to the region. We can no longer approach the region simply as an oil pump, nor can we approach the region as a place that is infantile in terms of its population, where we see them as, quote unquote, the Arab street. I mean, just the very term Arab street, by the way, is very interesting. We don't say Arab public opinion, we don't say Arab intellectuals, Arab liberals, we call it the Arab street, right? It's the street, these street people running around. We have to go beyond that. And it's not just words, by the way. One could argue, come on, it's just a term. It's not a term. It is how we are seeing the place. So A, we have to see the place as not simply an oil pump, but two, we have to begin to understand that this place is a place that has its own future to make. They will make their mistakes. They will screw up. I have no doubt about it. They're not perfect. I know that because I lived there, was born and raised there. And I've seen enough imperfections in the Lebanese Civil War to last me a lifetime. But the fact of the matter is, for at least now, their future is in their hands. What they do with it is their responsibility. And we have, in many ways, to abdicate that responsibility to them. They have to be responsible for their future. It's not ours. And in doing so, we still have a role to play. And I'm going to come here to the kumbaya moment. Look, we spent who knows how many hundreds of billions of dollars in Iraq. We spent a lot of money in Iraq. Afghanistan, we're spending quite a bit of money too. And arguably, and you know a lot better than me, but arguably from my point of view, our accomplishments are really not that great. But the reality is, there are other ways to deal with things. We can no longer approach the Middle East with a singular in a singular manner. And I'm going to quote The West Wing for a moment. I don't know how many of you have watched The West Wing, right? Right after 9/11, there were a series of shows about, a fictional country in the Middle East, with some really cute name that has nothing to do with Arabic. But there's a moment here in the show that it says the chief of staff turns to, I forgot who it was, and he says, these people only understand power. That's all they understand. He's talking about the Arabs, of course. That approach has got to go. Really, it's not good for the United States. It's really counterintuitive to exactly what's going on. We have to start thinking about the Middle East as a far more complex place. And if anything, I leave you with anything, the sort of takeaway from this talk, is we can no longer do what we did from 1945 to 2010. That is to see the Middle East from a very simplistic prism. It's either the strong man and the kings, or it is the boogeyman, the communists or the Islamists. We have to understand it as a complex place with a lot of its own interests. And if we begin to see it as such, again, this is not a naive approach, but it's a realistic approach. If we see the complexity of the region, I believe very strongly that the role of the United States in the Middle East will become far more fruitful, not only to them, but to us. Thank you so much.
Akram has graciously agreed to take some questions, and we have about 15 minutes. Please speak loudly. We do not have the microphones here.
Yes, go ahead, sir. I'll repeat the question.
Thank you. I'll just stand up. David Lett, thank you, Professor Khater. I have a question. One of the discriminating factors may have been in the success of these various developments in the Middle East, the attitude and the stance of the military, the army.
Right.
Could you address how that happened, why that happened, and what role the army might play in the outcome, as you say,
Sure.
where it might go?
Sure. So the question is about the role of the military in these things. And as you could probably tell, the military has, depending upon the country we're talking about, has done different things. But what is really interesting is a pattern. And that is the security forces tend to be very loyal to the regime, and the military tends to be one that is either sitting on the fence, or quite frequently they begin to switch positions. And in fact, in Egypt, the moment that Mr. Mubarak ultimately left is the moment that the military basically told him that he no longer has their support. In Yemen, we're seeing a split within the military about whether to support Saleh or whether to be against him, and there's a split there. What we find in Libya is that much of the military defected, and now they have joined these rebels. But in fact, there we see a lot less a situation where the military completely turned against Mr. Gaddafi, or Colonel Gaddafi, whatever he wants to call himself, right? So the military really is problematic. Now, the reason it's problematic is because much of the recruits, the young men primarily, there are a few women in some militaries, are sort of the people, by the people kind of group. I mean, this is the same thing that happened in Iran. You can use the military to suppress your population, but at the end of the day, they're going to go home. They leave their barracks and go home. And they go home to the very people they just shot at. So the army is incredibly unpredictable because of that. The leadership may very well be loyal to you, but the army itself is very unpredictable. What is very predictable are the security forces. These are you guys, and that's why it's no surprise, of course, if you look at most Middle East militaries, the special units, and the cute thing about the Syrian special units is they wear pink berets. I mean, they really went for fashion. But they were dreaded. The special forces were the best armed, best everything. It's kind of Republican Guard, everything you think about. So you have to maintain a small group. But the military as a whole is very much fractious. And that's what's unpredictable about it in that regard. Where we will go from here, it's very unclear again. Because if you look at Egypt, the military has had over 4 decades, I would say, of being really making a lot of money. I mean, these guys were involved in the economic well-being of Egypt. They make tons of money. There's a lot of political and economic power derived from position, and they're going to be loath to give it up. And I suspect in Syria it's equally the same. Not I suspect, I know. Most of the generals in Syria have a lot of business interests. And so they're the ones that are going to be fighting slowly but surely against any major changes. They are willing, I think, as we have seen, they're willing to get rid of some of the figureheads, but they are going to be less willing to change the whole system. Yes, sir.
I recently attended a conference at National Defense University.
I'll repeat the question.
Okay. And the conference actually dealt with basically the Middle East and Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And what surprised me was the fact that there was this streak of of nonviolence, the passive sort of thing that we see with Gandhi and Martin Luther King and so forth. And I was really impressed by a young Egyptian lady that essentially said what you said regarding the future. Her argument was simply that they didn't want to move too fast. They wanted to take their time and figure these problems out, Parliament and so forth. But she was rather pessimistic about it. Can you discuss with us the influence of this nonviolence influence on this? Because it didn't seem to me to come from, it was a difference between the two sides, the passive side essentially. I hate to use that term because I don't think Gandhi really liked it, but nonviolence.
Okay, so the question is about nonviolence. What we have noticed is that there's a great degree of nonviolence that was part and parcel of these demonstrations that took place in the various streets. Look, so on one hand, and again, this goes back to those sort of cultural stereotypes of Arabs, right? I really wasn't kidding when I said that the stereotype is that Arabs are violent. I don't know if any of you have seen the movie Delta Force. No? Well, you're lucky. It's Chuck Norris is a brilliant actor in that movie. And it's really interesting, and that's just one example of it. And there's a fantastic scene. This was about the hijacking of the TWA flight that Shiite Lebanese organization called Amal hijacked it and landed it in the airport in Beirut. And ultimately there was a negotiation, and it was negotiated. There were a couple of deaths, unfortunately, but ultimately it was negotiated. The crisis was negotiated out, and the plane took off. And TWA became known ever since as Travel with Amal instead of Trans World Airlines. But the interesting thing about the film is not how it goes, because of course that would be really boring for a Chuck Norris movie. The interesting thing is, of course, he has to kill a lot of people. And I watched this film in Lebanon, by the way. So I was sitting with a bunch of buddies that convinced me it's going to be a great movie. And so the plane lands, and you see the pilot and the co-pilot, and there's a civilian. I never knew why a civilian was in a cockpit, but it doesn't matter. And he was sitting there, and the scene is really quite remarkable, because you would see in the distance a group of men, right? And by the way, this was filmed in Israel. This was a group of men carrying World War II issue weapons. You can see them, you know, and they go rah, 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 literally. They're not saying anything, but literally this kind of guttural blah blah blah, you know, as if a child is saying it, right? And so the pilot says, "Who are these people?" And the camera shoots back to them, and they're doing rah, 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 you know, thing, and then shoots back to this guy, civilian, and says, "Arabs. They're Arabs," right? That scene captures how Arabs are seen, right? There are this irrational, violent people, you know, and Tommy Lee Jones, I think, had a film with Yemen, the same kind of concept. We always appear as a bunch of people that are irrational, shooting things or saying ridiculous things. So the image that all of a sudden there are these people demonstrating peacefully becomes shocking, because like, where did these guys come from? Where did they import them from, right? Did somebody go shopping for peaceful Arabs somewhere in Sweden? You know, so the fact of the matter is, that's one aspect, is that what I'm trying to say is that that's always been part and parcel of the culture. The idea that you don't solve everything violently. In fact, you try not to. But there's something much more practical than that. And that is, they learned very quickly that if you challenge the authority with guns, you're going to die quickly, and they're going to be able to squash you like a bug, and nobody's going to say anything because you lost your legitimacy. You immediately lost your legitimacy. And I think in many ways, Gandhi and Martin Luther King are part of it. But also, just as I said, you know, this guy sitting in Massachusetts writing a book about how to overthrow authoritarian regimes, it's immediately, you face them. And what is interesting is there's one word that people kept using, again, if you heard it in Arabic, in every demonstration I kept hearing it. It's called silmiya, peaceful. Silmiya, silmiya. They kept saying silmiya. And they would shout this to themselves, by the way, because, you know, it's hard to control large groups of people. And this took a lot of planning and organization, and that's what shocked a lot of people too, because anybody who's driven around Cairo would know that planning and organization are like oxymorons for Cairo streets. But this was planned, and they really went in thinking that it's going to be peaceful, because they understood that the cameras are going to be there. And this goes back to this notion of this flow of information. They knew there are going to be cameras. In fact, they knew, they depended on it. They coordinated the cameras. They wanted the cameras to be there because that's the only weapon they had, is people to see that we're not doing anything but protesting and they're shooting at us. And again, that image of the camels charging, you know, with the guns. So I think this idea of using peaceful protests was a very well thought out idea. And it's also, in many ways, partly because it's a new generation, and that's the third reason. It's a generation that has seen the failure of violence. within their society as well as outside. And what is really interesting here is that if you look at Egypt in the last 10 years, sexual harassment had skyrocketed. Skyrocketed. I mean, for a variety of reasons, and I'd be happy to tell you what they are, but it was phenomenal when I first went to Egypt in the mid-'80s and now how women, and regardless of what you're wearing, by the way, this is absolute rubbish if you're wearing the hijab, nobody's going to touch you, that's crap. They touch, these guys, I mean, they were just like gangs going around sexually harassing women. And what is really interesting is in these protests, there was a very conscious effort because in many ways they understood they're not simply overthrowing a political regime, they're overthrowing a political culture that depends on intimidation and violence against whether it's against women or whether it's against population. So I think this was a very reflective revolution in some ways. I don't think it's the same, by the way, in Libya or other places. Egypt, in this sense, is the more mature of the bunch. And again, so I don't want to paint them all as the same. Yemen and Libya are very different from Tunisia and Egypt. But nonetheless, there is a similar strand in that notion. Okay? Sorry, we'll go to this table. Yes?
Whatever the mistakes may have been in the past in U.S. foreign policy, if you were now advising policymakers, given where we are, what specific recommendations might you give?
Okay, so the question is, for those of you who didn't hear it, is if we're shifting towards a new era in the Middle East, what should the American foreign policy be for this new era? Is that right? Okay, so I think the era of using military power to change the Middle East is equally gone. And what I mean by that is, look, part of the reason we see a revolution happening now is because in many ways, for all the violence that was visited upon the region in the last 10 years, it really did nothing. Very little has changed. And so the era in which, as Suzanne was saying, the notion where you see everything as a nail because you have a hammer has got to go. You've got to go beyond that. I am not a pacifist. I believe that if there's a risk to a population, there's a risk to our country, we have to respond. I'm not a person who doesn't believe you can use violence at any time. But at the same time, I think it has to be the tool of last resort. So that's the first shift. Second, we really have to go beyond an Orientalist understanding of the Middle East. And what I mean by that, understanding the Middle East as the antithesis of Western world. The idea of clash of civilization that Samuel Huntington, propagated, completely historically fictional, by the way, and you could easily debunk it, but nonetheless becomes very powerful in policy circles. The idea that there's Islam like a single category, and by the way, if you think I'm defending my faith, I'm a Christian, so I'm not defending my faith. There's Islam as a single category, with 1+ billion people stretching from Jakarta all the way to Alaska, that somehow they're all the same, and then there's the West and we're all the same. That kind of facile, black and white, juxtaposition is also a thing that has to be of the past. The third element is we have to understand diplomacy beyond just the military, with all due respect, of course, to the military when you need it. But the reality is we have to understand that the United States wielded a lot of power through soft diplomacy. And let me give you a very quick illustration. After World War I, the United States, President Wilson, commissioned King and Crane. These were two guys from the United States. One was the president of Oberlin, one was a Chicago businessman, to go to the Middle East and do one of the first public polling. To go around, ask people living in the region, what do you want for your future? Remember the 14 points, one of which is self-determination. And what is really remarkable is when asked by King and Crane, in case we have to place a mandate over your newly established country, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, if we need to have a caretaker from outside, who would you want it to be? Over 97%, and this is not like a 99.9% elections in the Middle East, really 97% said the United States. And when asked why, it's because they think the United States stood for freedom and liberty and human rights and what have you. And I think, let me fast forward to the point where we end up being the most unliked country in the world, including in the Middle East. And I'll give you another polling, and this is by Zughbi Institute, but also Pew did the same polling. When they did, and they do this every year, in which they try to see a correlation between values all across the globe. And what is interesting is, when it comes to what we consider to be democratic values, there's an almost one-to-one correlation between the views of most people in the Middle East and the views of most people in the United States. The one place where they completely diverge is about sexuality. That's the one place where they go separate. The Middle Easterners tend to be much more conservative than in the United States. But beyond that, so we have to play to that strength. We have to go beyond seeing them as the opposite, because if we see somebody as the opposite, they will be the opposite. We will in fact create our own worst enemy because we are assuming ahead of time that So we actually have to play on the things that we have in correlation. And one of the things, the soft diplomacy is simple. I really believe in it because I was a product of it, right? I came here, my parents could not afford me to send me to university. I came here on a scholarship from McAllister College in St. Paul, Minnesota. My whole education cost them, I was just saying, maybe a cruise missile, but I don't even think a cruise missile would be that much. You could probably educate 10 of me with one cruise missile. So we have to approach that notion. We have to cultivate, and to do that, by the way, you need people who speak Arabic, Farsi, Turkish, Hebrew. We need that fluency. Look, 10 years after all of we've said and done with 9/11, we still don't have enough people who speak Arabic fluently. We don't. The French do, but we don't. Why? I have no idea. I mean, it's really remarkable. I mean, the French could do it. We certainly can. I would hope. My brother lives in France, so I can always tease him about that. So the fact of the matter is, we have to engage the place from a different mindset, as a place that is complex, that could potentially become a place where American products, and I'm not just talking about McDonald's, there's lots of that already, I'm talking about what's really powerful about this country, what we really actually care about in this country, the real values of this country, which is liberty, right? Pursuit of happiness, the very foundation of what I love about this United States, why I stay here, why I think this is an amazing country to me. It is a place which allows the individual to fulfill their potential. That stuff we can send over, and we can. Now again, I know you're thinking to yourself, California, kumbaya, too much pot. I never smoked pot though. My dad told me not to, and I didn't. So the fact of the matter is, it is real. It really does make a difference, and I think that's what we have to engage in. And the fourth element is we've got to stop thinking that in order to protect Israel, we have to agree with Israel 100% of the time. I think that's a fallacy. Even Israelis don't agree with Israel 100% of the time. Why should we? It is not in the interest of Israel or the United States, let alone the Palestinians and the Arab world, to agree with Israel all the time. I think we actually do them a disservice, especially those who are liberal and leftist within Israel. And I think it is time to excise the cancer of the Middle East, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's enough. It is boring. I mean, at the most basic level, I'm so bored with the thing, and I lived through many of it. It is boring. It is time that we move beyond it and stop thinking this incredibly ridiculous reductionist notion of Middle East nations as Arab and Jew. Those days are gone. The Middle East itself has to go beyond the 1920s model of a nation state, where if you're Syrian, you're Arab. That's rubbish, as we know from the Kurds that are protesting in Syria. And if you're Israeli, you're Jewish. That's not true. About 30% of the population now is Arab. Things are moving. We have to go to the open society that Suzanne was talking about. We can no longer talk about a closed economy, closed polity, closed identity. Those days have to go, and we have to push it towards that region. Sorry, I know I'm kind of sounding a little, beginning to spit here. Yes?
I've just spent the last 2 months in Sicily to take care of my old mother. And you cannot live in Sicily without living the refugee problem.
Yes.
Okay? So, do you think that the refugee problem, people coming from Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, Syria, inundating Sicily, first of all, the island of Lampedusa and the rest of Europe, is just a European problem? Or should the United States somehow do something about it?
I worked on immigration. That's actually one of my first book was on immigration. Historical immigration, but immigration. I'm a product of immigration. So to me, immigration is a good thing. I mean, I'm not going to stand here and be a hypocrite. Immigration is a very good thing. But it's not only a good thing for me because, I can wear a suit now and I have a nice job and I raise my family in a wonderful place. I think that's very true. And I think that's what a lot of immigrants aspire to be. But I think immigration, when it is done correctly, it is very good for the receiving country as well. And I think the United States stands as an example of that. I bet all I have to do is look at you. Most of you are not Native American, are you? No, I don't think so. Most of you came from immigrants. Well, but you also seem to have, Scottish Irish maybe a little bit.
I was born here, so I'm a Native American. That's a politically correct term.
Yeah, well, indeed. But most of us came from some sort of immigrant, and all you have to do is look at Ancestry.com, see how much money they make, to realize how many Americans come. But let me talk to Europe.
These refugees are
Sure.
exactly the young people you are describing.
Sure.
They are young male,
Yeah.
maximum 22 years old.
Sure.
22 years old, ready to attack, to go to the war, and nobody wants them.
Yes.
Italy cannot take them.
Nobody. No, I agree. I agree. So,
Forget about it.
yeah.
What
So.
do they do?
Well, this is the whole situation, and I think in many ways you have to look at why they're leaving, right? And they're leaving because they cannot sustain a life in where they're staying. I mean, most people really don't have a great desire to leave. Most immigrants tend to be pushed. There's a pull factor. And I think there's an American immigration mythology, the idea of, Statue of Liberty that attracts all these people like a beacon, like Batman at night. But the reality is it's much more of a push factor. And so as the Middle East and North Africa are changing, politically, but more importantly, economically and culturally, what you're going to see is a lot less people are going to immigrate. And I think both the United States, but also Western Europe, have a key role to play in reshaping the Mediterranean region. And the reality is, we're no longer thinking about Europe and North Africa and the Middle East. Now we have to think about a Mediterranean region that is culturally, politically, economically, and even in terms of environment, in terms of energy, the grid, what have you, is very much linked. And I think when you begin to think about along those lines, I'll give you one quick example, because I know Scott is probably waiting to get me off the podium here, but I'm holding on to it, Scott.
I know you are.
All right. So the Germans, Siemens, and various other partnerships are beginning to develop the largest solar farm in the world, right? And they're going to do it in the deserts in Algeria. And the idea is they have a lot of sun. Germany doesn't have so much. So you put them in the desert in Algeria, and then you connect it to the grid, and that grid feeds into Europe. Europe, in many ways, when you do something like that, you're creating jobs in Algeria, and then people are going to stay. You train them, they get to stay. So I think Europe and the United States has to invest in the economic welfare of these people. And I'll give you a very quick statistic, and I promise I'll shut up. Basically, what we need to do in order to stabilize the labor market in the Middle East and North Africa is close to about 30 million jobs have to be created over the next 10 years, right? And those are the people that will leave if you don't give them a job. That's what we have to do.
Unfortunately, we got to do that here first.
I think it's linked. Thank you very much.
Wow. Akram, you are no substitute. You are no filler. I'll tell you that.
I'm sure.
I think now you know why I asked Akram to come and speak to us. This was an impassioned talk. And you gave us a perspective that I suspect most of us never really heard before. A proud American, and yet one who is very, very conversant in all the very complex issues of what's going on in what is of the making of the Arab Spring. So Akram, I really thank you so much. As a very small token of our appreciation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you all. I can address that question later if you want, by the way. The jobs. I can address it with you if you want later.
Okay. We'll be